So this is the second video that we're going to look at for understanding how markets work. And this video looks at what's called utility. Utility is really a measure of why, or really kind of seeks to explain why the demand curve slopes downward. And what we're really kind of looking at is some of the psychology that goes behind consumer buying choices. So this is one element of why the demand curve slopes the way it does. The other element is known as the income effect and the substitution effect. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But what we're really looking at is consumer thinking. Now, utility is a measure of the satisfaction that consumers receive when they consume a good or service. And economists use a word, it's kind of a strange word, or most people think it's kind of a strange word. It's known as utils. A util is really kind of a relative measure. So the word we're talking about here is utils. It's a relative measure of satisfaction. What I mean by it's relative is it's not really a scientific measure. So kind of my favorite analogy is temperature. I could scientifically measure temperature. Okay, I could say it's 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That means something very, very specific. It's a scientific measure. Or at 0 degrees Celsius, that means something very, very specific. Okay, utils, by contrast, if I were to continue the temperature analogy, utils would be saying like it's hot or it's cold. So we're not measuring it specifically, we're measuring it relatively. And one of the keys of utility is different people get utility from different things. So we talk about utility as kind of satisfaction. That might not be the best way of describing it. Maybe benefit would be a better way. So for example, I don't get a lot of satisfaction when I pay a parking ticket, but I do get benefits in that I don't go to jail. Now, is it the basic tenet of utility for most goods and services is the more of a good or service we consume, the more utility we get from it, okay? And that's called total utility. So if I were to, for example, eat one cookie, that one cookie might give me 10 utils. If I were to eat a second cookie, those two cookies together might give me 18 utils, okay? So total utility is the overall amount of satisfaction, overall amount of benefit you get when you consume products and services. Marginal utility, however, this is a really important word, this marginal word, and we've seen this before and we're going to see this again, tells me how much extra utility I get if I consume one more of a good or service. Okay? So if I go from consuming one cookie to 2 cookies, how much additional utility does that second cookie give me? If I were to have a third cookie, how much additional utility would that third cookie give me? Okay, so it's the additional utility, not the overall benefit I get, but the additional benefit I get. Okay, and there's an economic law known as the law of diminishing marginal utility. Okay, or the idea of diminishing marginal utility. And that's the idea that the more of a product or service I get, the less additional utility I get from that product or service. Even things that are essential. The more of it I have, the less I appreciate it. A great example of this is water. We have water. It's very ubiquitous. It's everywhere. However, it's also essential to life. But I would argue for most people, most of the time, they don't really think about how much satisfaction or benefit you're going to get from water. Okay? However, if you get a brand new car, that car is going to give you a tremendous amount of benefit. The difference is you have a lot of water, so it's going to give you low marginal utility. You don't have a lot of new cars. So that one additional car is going to give you tremendous amounts of benefit. So here we have an example of marginal utility. I'm just going to pen on the screen kind of the formula for finding marginal utility. So marginal utility is found as the change in total utility divided by the change in quantity. So for example, as I go from 0 to 15, my marginal utility is 15. As I go from 1 to 2 units, my total utility increases, okay, but my marginal utility now is only 12 because my total utility had been 15, now it's 27. As I go from 2 to 3, my total utility increases by 36, but my marginal utility is only 9. The difference between my total utilities here. So as I go from 0 packs of gum to 1 pack of gum, my total utility goes from 0 units to 32. My marginal utility would be 32. As I go from 1 pack of gum to 2 packs of gum, my total utility increases from 32 to 48. My marginal utility would be 16. And as I go from 2 to 3, my total utility would increase from 48 to 56. My marginal utility would be 8, and so on and so forth. So the more packs of gum I consume, the less marginal utility I get. That's that idea of diminishing marginal utility. The more of something you consume, the less you value it. Now, the utility function graph is really your total utility curve. Okay, so you have your total utility, amount of utils over quantity. Okay, and you can see the slope of the curve. This slope is increasing, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. So as I go from A to B, it increases by 15. As I go from B to C, it increases by 12. As I go from C to D, it increases by 9. So it's increasing, but each unit increases by a little bit less than before. And this can become our marginal utility curve, which is going to be our utils over our quantity, and we can see it slopes downward. And if you really look at it, you can see the marginal utility curve really does reflect our downward sloping demand curve. So you kind of run into the question, why does the demand curve slope down? Well, it's because we get less and less utility the more of a product we actually consume. So the more we consume, the less value we get out of it, the less we would be willing to pay for it. Now, one final thing we need to look at is, as consumers, it's one thing to look at our utility. It's something else we need to look at is how much we actually spend. Because what we really want to do is we want to maximize our utility per dollar spent. And to find marginal utility, to find marginal utility per dollar, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the marginal utility divided by the cost of the good. Okay? So what that's going to look like is marginal utility over price. So let's say, for example, I'm looking at something that costs, I don't know, $1. And it gives me a marginal utility of 25. Okay? So I'm going to set up my formula like this: 25 utils over $1. My marginal utility equals, my marginal utility per dollar equals 25. Okay? And one thing that marginal utility per dollar kind of compensates for is the fact that expensive goods, like a house or a car, are always going to give us more utility than inexpensive goods. Okay? That doesn't mean we don't want to purchase inexpensive goods. It just means we want to think about how much we're spending versus how much utility that we're getting. Okay? So here I have, suppose a bottle of water costs $2. Okay? What would be the marginal utility per dollar of the fourth bottle? So here my fourth bottle is giving me, first thing I need to find is what's the marginal utility of the fourth bottle, excuse me. The marginal utility of the fourth bottle is going to be $6. Or 6, excuse me. To find the marginal utility per dollar, I'm going to take my marginal utility over the price, and it's going to be 6 over the $2. And my marginal utility per dollar is going to equal 3. Okay? Second problem is, what would be my marginal utility of the sixth bottle of water? Well, my sixth bottle is going to give me a marginal utility of 4. Okay, so it would be 4 over $2. My marginal utility per dollar is going to equal 2, right? So the more water I consume, the less marginal utility per dollar I'm going to get out of it. Now, the final thing we're going to look at, and we're going to practice this in class, this is a somewhat more challenging concept, is the idea that when consumers are consuming more than one good, one thing that they want to do, one goal of consumption, is to try to equalize the marginal utility per dollar. Okay, we want to get about the same marginal utility per dollar out of the goods we consume. Okay, so this is like the idea that the most bang for their buck. They want to get as much as they can for the dollars that they spend. So I want you to imagine for a moment we're consuming two goods, good A and good B. Okay, good A is giving us a marginal utility per dollar of 18. Good B is giving us a marginal utility per dollar of 3. Okay, so the question becomes, what should we do? We want to try to bring these two marginal utilities per dollar to be equal to one another. So I want to decrease the marginal utility per dollar of good A while increasing the marginal utility per dollar of good B. And this is where it's important to remember that law of diminishing marginal utility. The more of something I consume, the less utility it's going to give me. Okay? So what I would want to do here is we would want to consume more good A. We would want to, the more we consume, the less marginal utility per dollar we're going to get. Okay? And we would want to consume less of good B. So we're going to increase the marginal utility per dollar. So if you think about it, here's my marginal utility. Here's my quantity. If we remember, it slopes downward. Okay? So let's say we're talking about good B. This is good B right here. If I consume less of good B, I'm going to raise my marginal utility and raise my marginal utility per dollar. If it's good A, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to want to make more of it. If I make more of it, I'm going to actually lower my marginal utility per dollar. This chart is kind of a good way of thinking about it. Think about it like a seesaw, and we want to bring the two ends of the seesaw into balance. Again, that's kind of a more challenging concept, and that's a concept that we'll practice in class.